Wheeler's dilemma is this, Brush said. How can one maintain a strong version of the Copenhagen interpretation? How can one maintain a strong version of the Copenhagen interpretation in which the observer is inextricably entangled with that which is observed, while at the same time denying that our consciousness affects that which we are conscious of, and thus accepting the possibility of telekinesis and other psychic effects? For Wheeler himself, there is no dilemma at all. One simply has to recognize, quote, the clear distinction between one, the strange but well-verified and repeatable features of quantum mechanics, and two, the pseudoscientific, non-repeatable, and non-verified so-called extrasensory perception. But Wheeler's own views are likely to strike a non-physicist as being just as bizarre as those of the parapsychologists he deplores. Indeed, no one has yet formulated a consistent worldview that incorporates the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics while excluding what most scientists would call pseudosciences: astrology, parapsychology, creationism, and thousands of other cults and doctrines. Well, I feel a certain tug of that. Indeed, no one has yet formulated a consistent worldview that incorporates the Copenhagen interpretation while excluding what most scientists, let's say John Preskill, I'll pick on him, or other cosmologists that I know, I think they think this is about pseudoscience. So, the issue is, one can imagine going down the track of including the observer, but maybe maybe one shouldn't go too far. I think sometimes I sense that this is the distinction between Chaslov's and my own sort of views of things. I think maybe Chaslov worries that we go too far, and I worry that Chaslov hasn't gone far enough. Or I look to Richard Healy, wherever he is. He's gone too far. Oh, he left, okay. And he certainly thinks I've gone too far, and I think he hasn't gone far enough. So anyway, that is the subject of this panel.
So I had understood the different thing actually. Sorry.
Yes, so I start saying a few words, probably not more than 5 minutes. So I thought after Philip's talk that maybe we should rename this as realism, but I thought better of it. So I mean, similar to what Chris was said, I mean, I'm not going to answer the question, does it go too far? I think the question really should be, does it go far enough? Yeah. Take cubism. So it's a thoroughly participatory. It's thoroughly participatory. We take probabilities as personal to an agent, quantum states, Hamiltonians, yes, models personal to the agent. So it's participatory in this way. A measurement is an action taken by an agent. Measurement outcomes are personal to the agent. They inform future actions of the agent, so it is thoroughly participatory. It leads to a consistent interpretation. It resolves puzzles. For instance, it resolves the puzzles that Renato and Chaslav described in their talks. But yet it's a common view that this goes too far. And, well, I don't share that. I think it doesn't go far enough, but let's just look at people who think it goes too far. They think, despite, even if they agree that it's a consistent view that resolves puzzles, they think the price is too high to pay. And the idea is usually that it stops being physics. Physics is for people who think it goes too far. Often it's an enterprise that should discover the laws of nature, should describe nature in exactly an agent-independent way. That's what physics is describing nature as it is, independent of us, and also to discover the laws according to which it evolves. And so, in a sense, I mean, to put it very pointedly, what lots of these people are looking for is a modern version of a clockwork universe. you want to discover immutable laws according to which the universe evolves. These laws might be stochastic, but it is some version of a clockwork universe. And I really take exactly the opposite view. I think, well, who would want to live or work in a clockwork universe? So, I mean, the quotes by Nagel that Hans gave go bit in this direction. In a clockwork universe, there is really no real place for agency, and there's no real place for our importance. So I would much rather live in a world that is truly participatory, in which in which our decisions truly matter. So it's a much richer and much more interesting. And I mean, let me just comment on one extra thing. I was thinking about, I think it was Ritter Healy in his talk who mentioned humility. I don't think wanting our actions to matter is actually in contradiction with humility. It's you can be very humble about your role in the world and still want your actions to matter and should believe that our actions matter. So that is really my main reason to believe that definitely participatory realism doesn't go too far. Why does it not go far enough? Well, well, there are maybe three strands. One is maybe Chris's or our project of deriving the quantum formalism from principles that say something directly about the world. So in that way, I think, well, we would want that. We would still want to say things about the world, and we would like the formalism to come out of these ideas about the world we have. So it should be less abstract. And other strands, well, for instance, I think that in the talk by Michel Bitbol about, well, you could say, quantum mechanics and phenomenology. So that's the kind of direction in which I would like us to go further. And I think I stop with that and hand over to, I don't know what's the connection.
You want to?
I don't mind. The best way I could make sense of answering the question was to look at something Chris has written previously, I guess in 2002, I think. So it's from the Quantum Mechanics is Quantum Information Mostly paper, I think. And there Chris says the following. This I see as the line of attack we should pursue with relentless consistency. The quantum system represents something real and independent of us. The quantum state represents a collection of subjective degrees of belief about something to do with that system, even if only in connection with our experimental kicks to it. The structure called quantum mechanics is about the interplay of these two things, the subjective and the objective. The task before us is to separate the wheat from the chaff. If the quantum state represents subjective information, then how much of its mathematical support structure might be of that same character? Some of it, maybe most of it, but surely not all of it. So I guess my reading on the how far goes too far question is, to what extent does capturing too much perhaps lead us to call into question the very starting point of the investigation? So I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just posing it. Or perhaps I just.
If
So
we recapture too much, I'm sorry. Which,
if
there's nothing left, you mean?
if there's nothing left, yeah. So
what do we conclude if there's nothing left?
what do we conclude if there's nothing left? Do we conclude that there's nothing left, or do we conclude that maybe the starting point of the investigation was misguided? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I'm just posing it. So that's the sense. That's what I understood by how far it goes too far. It's one way of posing that question. And I guess as a side question as well, like just what does it mean to have too much? So Chris talked about the Born rule as a normative constraint imposed upon us by the world, and as that as somehow capturing some objective feature of the world. But is it right to say that it captures an objective feature of the world, or is it better to say it's only an objective feature of our relation to the world? And does that count as the wheat, or does it count as the chaff? Just a question, maybe that I want to put out there. But let me talk a little bit about a starting point. How can we think of the starting point of the investigation? So again, let's look at one of Chris's papers. This one, a lot more recent. It's from his Notwithstanding Bohr paper. And so here he begins by, this is on page 6, Chris begins by quoting William James. And he writes, James writes, in the form, one can make no claim on the bare ground of his temperament to superior discernment or authority. There arises thus certain insincerity in our philosophic discussions. The potentest of all our premises is never mentioned. I am sure it would contribute to clearness if in these lectures we should break this rule and mention it. And I accordingly feel free to do so. And then Chris goes on. And as such, Chris also feels free to do so myself. Wheeler's vision of a world built upon law without law, a world where the Big Bang is here, and the observer is a participator in the process, attracted Chris like no other physical ideas he had ever heard before. They were in fact the potentest of all Chris's premises. So this is the starting point of the the cubist version of the participatory realist point of view, I would say. This is a nice way of encapsulating it. And you can think of this as a kind of world-building enterprise. Right? So beginning from this, not world in the passive, like traditional physical sense of world and some ontology out there, but a kind of like a world of our experience, a world of our world, creating our world from this fundamental starting point. Now, I want to move a little bit. So in the invitation for the workshop, part of the motivation for it was this distinction that Adan made in a recent paper between type 1 and type 2 interpretations of quantum mechanics. And cubism isn't the only interpretation that Adan called participatory realist. And so I only want to talk about Copenhagen, or a particular version of the Copenhagen, because we've heard a lot about this one as well in this past week. And I want to consider how my understanding of a particular version of the Copenhagen interpretation, how it fits. Does it really fit within this framework, or is it maybe misdescribed by the label participatory realism or not? So I'm thinking about Bohrianism in particular. So we think of the project of physics, or one of the projects of physics, to somehow advance from a notion of some subjective perception of some phenomena to an objective description of that phenomenon. So an objective description of the object as it really is, in some sense, quote unquote. Then the natural thing to ask is, how can we continue to do this in the light of quantum mechanics? And I don't want to go into a lot of exposition that you've all heard many times before. I just want to merely state Bohr's particular conclusions about this. So Bohr, 35, and this is the causality and complementarity paper. He writes, "Indeed, we have in each experimental arrangement suited for the study of proper quantum phenomena, not merely to do with an ignorance of the value of certain physical quantities, but with the impossibility of defining these quantities in an unambiguous way." So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, he writes, elsewhere, in many places, but here's a nice expression of it. On the other hand, it must be above all recognized that, however far quantum effects transcend the scope of classical physical analysis, the account of the experimental arrangement and the record of the observations must always be expressed in common language, supplemented with the terminology of classical physics. So you have these two kind of statements that are in tension. On the one hand, the results of our experiments, the reports, our communications with one another must always be expressed in common language in some sense, causal, spatial, temporal language in some sense. On the other hand, in the domain of quantum mechanics, we're faced with the impossibility of defining these quantities with respect to objective experience in an unambiguous way. So what do we do? Well, another way of posing the problem is, given a framework of classical concepts, that on the one hand is epistemically primary in some sense. So that's what's being expressed here. So there's a sense in which these concepts are epistemically primary to us. And on the other hand, they can be shown to be of limited validity in the domain of quantum theory. How can we nevertheless continue to fruitfully use these concepts, the concept of such a framework, in a context for which the principles underlying them are known to break down? And this is so in this sense, so this is the fundamental question I take Bohr to be trying to answer. And in this way, I might be disagreeing with Karen a little bit about what I take Bohr's project to be. But that's the fundamental project I take Bohr to be pursuing, which is the methodological, epistemological problem of how this is possible. And Bohr's answer, which I don't want to get into, because we've heard about it a few times this week, is the complementarity answer. But irrespective of Bohr's particular answer, what I want to call attention to is not the particular answer, but just the project in general. This methodological, epistemological project in general. That's what I want to call attention to. And I want to point out that it's not obviously a world-building exercise in the same sense as the Cubist project is. So I'll just end with a few questions. So given the project as I described it, which is characterized here as a participatory realist project. I'm not denying that it is, but I want to ask a few questions about this. So on the one hand, is this methodological, epistemological question a properly philosophical or foundational question? In the sense that, can we, if we answer this question, can we, as from the philosopher's point of view, as a person who's working on foundations point of view, can we think of that as a satisfactory answer, a satisfactory way of understanding quantum theory in some sense? Or must it be that we need to have a deep or world-building explanation of our theories of quantum phenomena? And in what sense is a solution to that methodological problem a form of participatory realism? So I think, in the sense of trying to come to grips with the practice of quantum mechanics, I can see participation in there, participatory in there. Realism, I'm not sure if the question is even addressed in the kind of approach to quantum mechanics that I'm looking at there. And finally, what would it mean to go too far in this context? That's, I don't know how
long. So I'm very, very grateful to Chris for the opportunity I was given to attend this workshop. I'm sorry I'm going to read my notes, otherwise it will take very long. I don't know if I am in a good position to comment about the future of the program that we have been discussing, but I would like to start by saying that I learned a lot, so I'm very grateful to everybody actually. I'm very confused, but I think that we could agree that the idea to put together such a large spectrum of contributions was in the end quite successful. At least this is my impression. Now, if I had to summarize my personal conclusions, the first thing I would say is that yes, pragmatist philosophy and the foundations of quantum mechanics have much to contribute to each other. With a proviso, which is that by the label pragmatist, I refer maybe not so much to the classical tradition that Manuel presented in his talk, as to more contemporary developments, like those which were mentioned by Richard, for example, in his talk, but also by other people. So that's my first point. And the second, probably more controversial, I think that Niels Bohr has something to do with that, actually much to do with that. Particularly if we consider the two strategic axes of the program, so the problem of objectivity on the one hand, and the problem of reconstruction on the other hand. And the reason for that is that I have the impression that, especially after the discussions we had during these days, that if QB is to work its way out of the conceptual issues that, at least in my view, it still faces, that can only be achieved by placing more emphasis on the participatory connotation. And this is, I think, where some of Bohr's intuitions may provide workable inspiration. So I'm also on the side of those who think that the program was not pushed far enough, actually. So let me briefly consider the two problems I've mentioned in turn. The first is the problem of objectivity. A cornerstone of some of the approaches that have been proposed here seems to be that the idea that the facts to which probabilities refer, so in particular measurement outcomes, are to be identified with an observer's individual experience, personal experience. In this sense, the facts would be relative to the observer. Now, my worry is that in spite of the Cartesian preconception according to which we tend to regard personal experience as a kind of unproblematic given, this way of dealing with the paradoxes of quantum mechanics may in fact turn out to be less stable than it appears. And this is not a metaphysical concern. So, to be clear, the worry is not that this solution implies a departure from standard realist view. It's quite the opposite. And I see in particular two problems. First, there is a tension between the normative status attributed to the Born rule by qubits and the personalist view of facts. If facts are essentially private, where does an objective rule for updating beliefs stem from? So that's the first point. The second is that I'm suspicious about the very consistency of the notion of a relative fact. It could be the case that such a notion presupposes that of absolute or objective fact, in the sense that from a conceptual point of view, it may turn out to be impossible to make sense of the former notion without assuming the latter, at least when it comes to measurement outcomes. So in fact, what I'm implying is that in order to make sense of the notion of relative fact, maybe one actually, in the end, needs to presuppose the notion of absolute fact. This is a point I'm not going to argue, but surely the pragmatist tradition, represented by Wilfried Sellers, provides powerful arguments that would be relevant, I think, in this context. So because of these concerns, what I want to suggest is that it might be worth exploring the kind of solution that Richard sketched in his talk, which, by the way, is nicely summarized in a passage by Wheeler that Amanda was quoting on the first day. I don't know if you remember. There is this sentence of Wheeler in his typically Bohrian mood, and he says, "Could it be that language in action is the shaking hand?" At least I understood like this. I don't know if this is correct, but so what is the idea? The idea is that a consistent pragmatist account of the role that objectivity plays in our epistemic practices might prove more convincing if it dropped any representationalist temptation, as those which are in fact implicit in the subjectivist approach, and focus instead on a social dimension, the social dimension of these practices. This is, I'm sorry, kind of slogan, but so the idea is that one could undertake to analyze how the notion of an independent fact, where independent means independent of any observer's beliefs, for example, how such a notion might emerge from the interplay between first and third person attitudes. So, for example, the interplay between endorsing a degree of belief, or endorsing a belief at some degree, let's say, and also attributing a belief to another person. So the focus is on both aspects at the same time. It's not just a matter of having a belief, it's also a matter of attributing belief to others. And here I think, in this context, I think that both allusions to an intimate relationship between objectivity and communication, or more precisely the condition for communication, might find a consistent interpretation and might also lead to interesting formal developments, I think. And this brings me to the second axis of the program, namely reconstruction. The attempt to bring out a link between the problem of reconstruction and the problem of objectivity is the feature that of cubism that I personally find most interesting, most intriguing. What I suspect, however, is that this link could in fact be stronger than the current formulation of the program implies. And even more radically, it seems to me that the very achievement of the program, maybe even the consistency of the program, at least as I understand it, requires proving that such a strong link exists. Now, what do I mean by a link? And this is not a trivial question. The gist of the idea is that if we require that a practice in which agents endorse and attribute beliefs should make room for objectivity in the sense that I just described, then this requirement could give rise to formal constraints that may somehow determine the normative structure. So, for example, the board rule. And here too, I think it's instructive to recall Bohr's views, in as much as complementarity can be understood as a sort of implicit and somewhat, quite rudimentary attempt to implement this Kantian idea. We know that Bohr conceived of complementarity as a new conceptual framework whose purpose was to provide the only possible objective description of phenomena. This is what he said. So the way complementarity was supposed to fulfill this task was precisely by imposing new rules on the way concepts, and more specifically observables, can meaningfully be combined so as to give rise to systems of inferences, probabilistic inferences, that qualify as acceptable. And here too I'm referring actually to Richard Stokes. Anyway, quite independently of Bohr, and this is the conclusion, the relation between reconstruction and objectivity lies at the heart of what is, in my view, the main philosophical challenge that cubism faces, namely that of combining normativity, that is the idea of a set of rules that agents do not merely obey or fail to obey, but should obey. And this should be combined with a purely naturalistic description of the processes in which the agents are involved. This is, of course, an old issue in philosophy, and an especially deep one, as Hans pointed out today. And this confirms what, in my view, is the first merit of Cubist, one interpretation of quantum mechanics. Not so much, or not only that it provides the right answers, as that it raises really interesting questions.
So I wanted to make some warning noises about the word experience, and then try and make some reconciliatory noises about objectivity and the existence of the external world. So experience has been a term that's loomed large in this meeting, and indeed experience understood as something like first personal and private to the agent. And of course there's a grand tradition in philosophy which has sought to reconstruct the world, or reconstruct our knowledge of the world from some such private first personal elements. I think it's fair to say that tradition has been an abject failure. So there doesn't exist a single example of a successful reconstruction of any significant part of the world, or indeed of our conceptual scheme, on the basis of a thin level of first personal private sensations or experiences. And it doesn't seem that that's just an accident that's happened. There seem to be systematic reasons why it's so. Primarily that the basis from which one's traditionally seeking to build some mental items, some sensations, some sense data, which are private to oneself and which are perhaps themselves indubitable, don't plausibly exist. So it would seem unlikely to be successful if we want to try and build a world or our knowledge of the world out of things like that. So just as a test case to help illustrate the point, think about what you're currently experiencing, thinking about particularly your visual perceptual experience in this current moment, try and think about what the content of that experience would be if you tried to detach from it all of the concepts of the things which are independent from you within it. So try and take away all of the concepts which are independent of your own mind in there. Take away the concepts of tables, chairs, light bulbs, people, all the rest of it. You'll find that it's quite hard to do. In fact, plausibly, it's impossible to do. That one's ordinary reports of experience are completely riddled, saturated with conceptual content. I think this was something very important that Hans was talking about in his talk. I'm putting it in a slightly different way. But that our ordinary perceptual experience is not private and restricted to the inside of our minds. It's already suffused with externality. That's perhaps consonant with some of the things we heard about the phenomenological tradition that was mentioned this morning by Michel Bitbol. So I mention that only because there's a great attraction to the idea that surely there's something that I've got myself personally in my mind that I can be sure of, several of them one after the other, or many of them at the same time, many after the other, and I can build the world out of that because surely that's what I have access to. But that's a particular picture of the nature of experience, which has been among the least successful in the philosophical tradition. It's attractive, we keep going back to it, but it has never ever worked. So my advice is that if one wants us to build a participatory realist picture, one oughtn't to try and build it from something like that very thin, non-existent starting point of sense state or something like that. What's encouraging is perhaps that, perhaps when people are talking about experience, they don't really mean something like that thin, traditional empiricist conception of experience. And certainly Hans didn't mean it in his talk. So I would commend attending to the kind of extra structure that Hans was talking to that brought agency, action, kicking backwards, forward and backwards with the world via modelling, or one might put it more generally via representation, as part of what it is to have experiences with determinate character. Another similar kind of example to do perhaps with the concept of oneself now. I was very interested to hear about G.H. Mead and from the talk we had earlier on pragmatism on the very first day. I hadn't heard about this notion of the social self, and that seemed to be very interesting. There's a similar kind of argument that comes from Peter Strawson, which argues that, seeks to assert that I can't even conceive of myself as a possible subject of experiences if I can't conceive of others being similarly of the same kind and subject to similar kinds of experiences. That is, the Cartesian conception of the independent mind is an incoherent one. One concept can't be the concept of an individual ego, because this is because of his general conceptions about the nature of what it was to be a concept. Concepts must apply of their essence to more than one kind of thing. So I need to have a plurality of objects which are possible subjects of experience. So we're not isolated in the world. If I can think of myself as a subject of experience, that's only because I can think of you lot too as subjects of experience. So some warnings about how not to try and develop a worldview on the basis of too thin a notion of experience, or indeed of the self. Picking up on something in Marcus's talk, he had this nice quote from Gardner about the hypothesis of the external world and how well confirmed this was. Again, that's a kind of picture that one often sees. One sees that Quine certainly talked in that kind of way. I think hypothesis is just the wrong word here. Hypothesis makes it sound as if it's something that's up for grabs, that a rather sophisticated cognizer might have thought, well, things could be this way or they could be that way, and I'll make a choice between them. That seems extremely implausible as an account of the genesis of our own individual conceptions of the external world. It seems to me that more likely that the existence of the external world is more like a precondition for the possibility of theorizing at all. It's not a possible thing theorized. It's not as if we have a choice in the matter. And so here I would disagree sharply with, say, somebody like Carnap, who said, well, you can adopt a material object way of talking about the world, or you can adopt a sense station kind of way of talking about the world. It's just which one do you find more convenient. I think it's deeper than that. More hangs on it. It's not just an hypothesis. Okay, so what am I doing at a meeting on participatory realism? Hasn't this put me in the camp of the evil representationalist, believers in the external world, possibly even a block universe person, who knows? Well, we've been careful to try and distance ourselves from talk of the external world, or at least unquestioning talk of the external world and its objectivity here. But there are, of course, different things that one might mean by some things being objective. That was a very useful point that Richard Healy drew attention to in his talk. And I think there's much that one can take, actually, quite happily with the notion of representation, which be consistent with the kinds of things that one would want as a participatory realist, or even, indeed, as a cubist. So it's quite possible to have a perfectly ordinary notion of mind-independent truth, and some notion of, very often, our interaction with the world being mediated by representations of the world, not solely by representations of the world, but quite often mediated by them. If one has an account of meaning which isn't too independent of our activities in the world, thus perhaps as some pragmatists strive, and if one has a sufficiently thin notion of truth, of which various exist, so one can perfectly well say, look, the notion of truth is entirely mind-independent. It's not up to me or you or whatever, what any of our beliefs are about how things are. Things are either thus or so. Even so, the world doesn't necessarily, or doesn't in fact, need not have a structure independently of our activities of thinking and acting and being in the world. That is to say, you can only get into the business of there being questions of truth or falsity once one's set up a conceptual scheme which will allow you to articulate propositions which might then be true or false. They're true or false just in virtue of how the world is. We don't make it the case that the thing is true or false. We do make the concepts. So there we have some good deal of objectivity. Truth is mind-independent. We also have a lot of what a more participatory flavoured view might like, namely to say that it's up to us. There aren't structures. There isn't even a notion of structure before we begin to set up the means of representation, before we set out the conceptual scheme. So it's not the case that any sense can be made of the world's having a structure independent of our ways of thinking about it, even though questions of truth or falsity are not determined by how we think, apart from trivial cases of truth or falsity via analytic truth or falsity. So we might want to applaud various pragmatist directions. We might want to applaud participatoriness, but we can do that consistent with keeping an awful lot of ordinary notion of truth and mind-independent objectivity. I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Questions? So we do it like yesterday. We start by questions from the audience, and then we go through some of these little sticky papers.
It's less a question, but it's about participative realism, and so at the moment, still it seems to me that cubism is a framework. It's a framework that is broad enough to allow this participative realism. However, I've heard David Merrin talking about classical realism, which is obviously compatible with the black block universe idea, and which tells me that we urgently need really kind of reconstruction of quantum theory and some additional elements in the framework that would force us actually to take this as a participative realism, starting from the idea. The other thing that I always, and I mentioned this previously, I still have, always the problem that I have cubism, and again, is that in a certain sense it seems that not all observers are symmetric, in the sense that there is the one that really have a pure state assignment, and as you said, this is the one that put the most effort. And that would be fine if there would be no limit in this putting the effort, because then it's just the question of the observer effort. But the fact that you cannot improve your knowledge over the pure states indicates something non-trivial there, which again is a restriction that I don't see is coming from the Bayesian approach alone, but is maybe a part of the reconstruction within this framework. That's all that I want to say.
Okay.
I'm curious whether there's a connection between what Czaslaw just said and Stefano's remarks about.
2 days and
Yeah.
Because I didn't quite understand the. So he said he was most intrigued by the reconstructive aspect.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand that
But
completely.
in fact, I'm intrigued by the link that I suspect there could be in your problem between the problem of objectivity, I mean, how to somehow account for objectivity, intersubjectivity within kind of subjectivist approach that you take, and reconstruction. So the two problems could be actually, I mean, I think that if you can solve one, either you solve the two together, and I think there could be a way to exploit, I mean, I try to allude to this Kantian strategy which take objectivity as a requirement, and from there reconstruct the normative structure somehow. That's precisely what you need. But I think that if reconstruct, I mean, the strong program of reconstruction would be one that derive as much as possible from purely, I don't know, conceptual analysis. This was the old strong program of quantum logic, maybe. And so not just to reduce things to a few general or natural empirical principles. That's not what I mean here. That's another strategy. The starting point is that the requirement that there must be objective facts. And from there, you try to derive the formal constraints that you can use in order to reconstruct the normative structure, which is the Born in your case. I think where we agree is that
You and Czaslaw.
yeah, it's very important that you find out a more convincing way to derive the Born rule. No, I don't know. That's what.
What's reconstruction?
I mean, I think in Qubits, if Qubits could really provide some kind of something equivalent in a way to the Dutch book argument or something to support the derivation of the Born rule, that would be an extremely powerful. But I mean, that's obvious. Then, the point can also be that if you don't, then you have a real problem.
Can you elaborate more on the objectivity side? Because I wouldn't know where to start if I wanted to say, let's put some objectivity, let's make something objective. Like, what is the thing you have in mind? Because as we learned in many talks, like, this
Do
wouldn't
you
be
remember
objectivity about measurement outcomes, unless we just decide that some things are ontological measurements, and then you don't have Wigner friend and all this type of arguments. So which would be the object? What would
Do you remember Richard Healy talks? Because I'm not going now to expose the whole.
No, I do remember that, but I don't
So
see
he has,
this
let's say,
in the
he has a
formalism of
story.
quantum theory. I mean, I would like to see which piece of the formalism is the one where you say, here I can see there is objectivity. Because reconstructions are very concrete things where we talk about things that we can see now in the current formalism, at least, or we could see maybe in a probability theory for cubisms, but there are kind of pretty concrete things. So it's like, if we want to put some objectivity there, we should somehow. It must be one of these finite set of 10 things. I mean, there is not so much freedom there.
Yeah, I confess, I'm not sure I see the question is, I should formulate the requirement explicitly in order to add this to the axioms from which you derive I'm not sure I see what you asked. I'm sure it's not clear what I said. It was not the
I was
point.
wondering whether there was a more concrete notion of objectivity in quantum
There's
mechanics
some things
that
that-
you should turn into an axiom.
There's some things that people have said over the past week, like reproducibility, intersubjective.
In the subjectivity, because if
So
you
like
start
for
with
instance,
subjectivity,
in quantum mechanics, there are some
communicability.
measurements that are repeatable. Let's build an axiomatization based on the
now I see
existence
what you
of
mean, I see.
repeatable measurement. Which, well, that's what.
Okay.
Is this what you mean? In this case, we would be very happy. We are trying to do
Well,
something.
no, I mean, this is precisely the topic on which I work, but it's very complicated.
Mhm.
I'm not able to give you an answer like this, because the idea is that you want to have a kind of pragmatist theory, which, starting from the analysis of linguistic practice, I mean, it's a long story, and starting from that, you can somehow try to define what you mean by objectivity, and I mean, and then formalize all these things. It has been done. There have been people who have carried out this program to some extent, and so I confess I cannot give you an answer in 2 minutes. It's but it's it has been formalized. So I think I could possibly give you an answer. We could sit together and try to.
Yeah, I mean, for the moment, the thing that I could see, like, some measurements are repeatable.
But-
This could be the beginning of that story.
Yeah, it's
I was
something
trying
of
to
this kind,
pinpoint
because
to
you
a
start with
technical
personal
point in
beliefs.
quantum theory, where we really say, let's start from this. Let's.
Yeah.
This could be.
Yes,
So I'm happy.
I give you an answer later.
Maybe I would like to make a brief comment on Chasta's questions, because most of the answer was actually repeated the doubts about the cubist approach. And so there were 2 points. The first one was about, I don't know which order they were, but pure states. So pure states basically representing the best possible knowledge. Now in cubism, I'm afraid we actually allow 2 agents to have different pure state assignments. So it is not the case that if somebody assigns a pure state, then everybody else must agree, oh, you have worked hardest. So that's also not what I meant. I mean, the criterion for quality might be really, I mean, how hard you work and how much you take into account. That's the criterion. Not the criterion is not that in the end you ended up in a pure
You're
state.
not referring to the grand situation, but
No, no.
But by playing a betting, would one of them win at the end?
Well, in any bet, one will win and the other will lose.
Then for that one that win, why this guy cannot improve his knowledge, and there is nobody else who can win against this guy? That's my question. That's the non-trivial restriction coming from quantum theory.
Well, if you think that the situation and the states are objectively given, then of course you're right. If you think of the 2 opposing viewpoints, they're both internally valid, then you have different predictions about it from the 2 different sides, and they will win. But there's no a priori guarantee, which you seem to imply, that one of them will be right and one will be wrong. So it's.
I think in a sense that here a pure state would be the one who has the pure state is the one who is the boldest, not the one who is working the hardest.
I like that. A quantum state is an expletive.
Good. The other one was about.
Declaration.
That's nice.
Yes, I'm very sure of that.
I think we would invite you in our lab, but let me control the system and let bet. And I want to bet. I really want to lose money.
Well, then we will bet. If you want to lose money. Actually, I mean, I can't see what your point is. I mean, you invite me in your lab and we bet on the outcomes. Sure. I mean, I don't see what relevance this has to your question, actually.
It has, because I feel that there is nobody else, because I don't want to realize this, and I think that there is nobody else who will bet better than me on that.
Well, that actually is implied by your pure state assignment.
I don't
Yes.
know if it's implied. Let's bet. I mean,
No, no, no. It is actually implied by your views. That's what you need.
It is implied, but let's bet and see who will win now. I don't care about now philosophical background. I just do it.
Okay. So I think, I mean, since I'm the chair, I think we have actually, how do you say, explored this thing. We should move on. The second question was reconstruction, and I think the role of participatory realism in reconstruction. And I think we are trying to address this explicitly in the Cubist reconstruction of quantum mechanics, where the main axiom...
We're just stupid and haven't done it yet.
We haven't fully done it, but mostly because we find distasteful one of the assumptions that are still necessary, which is the unitary symmetry, which you need at the moment, which you want to get rid of. But the main axiom actually is of the flavor that it directly expresses the participatory nature of the world, let's say. So that's what the main axiom, this modified law of total probability, tries to express.
My comment was just that as far as I see it right now, it's not mandatory, because there is also classical Bayesianism, which is compatible with non-participative realism.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can of course put this an axiom, but
Well, that actually links up to...
come out from something.
Yeah,
more
absolutely. It would be nice if he pinpointed it. If one could run a Dutch book argument.
Well, actually, no. I don't think that would be nice, because there would
Not
be
a logical Dutch book argument, but Dutch book
Okay.
with some extra empirical
Okay.
little ingredient.
Okay.
But
It remains
something
an
about
empirical rule.
inconsistent gambling in light of a previous commitment about the world.
But it remains an empirical rule.
So let
Yeah.
just to can I follow up on this 1 second, just to so what I was suggesting, and then I can stop, but is that instead of a Dutch book argument, one could think of something like a requirement for objectivity, given that you don't have objectivity from the start in your approach. You require objectivity and you get the rule, instead of using the argument I have in mind is actually based on rationality, so it's not so different from, but just to clarify, so.
Manuel? Then
Just to be sure that I understand, and I just again insisting on Julio's question, like objectivity means you said you require objectivity, you mean you focus on, for instance, repeatable measurements, some actions you do and you always get the same outcome, and then this creates in you the illusion of objectivity, and you I need to understand what you mean.
I see.
I mean, might be an example of objectivity.
I'm sorry, because that was clearly the central point in what I said, but I'm would take too long to try to formulate more precisely what I was saying. I wouldn't say it's a kind of repeatability requirement. The idea was just that if you start with subjective experience, for example, you don't have objectivity in many senses. You don't have truth, for example. You don't have and then there are many things that you have to explain because you lack these notions. Many facts in our practices. But I'm not sure I would like to expand on this. We can discuss it later. Maybe. I'm afraid it's a little bit too far from the... I'm sorry, but that was my fault actually. Because
So, still on this notion of objectivity. No, but I was a bit confused concerning the discussion just now on objectivity, because you were talking about reproducibility, we were talking about facts, outcomes, and for me all those are elements outside outside the theory. While the program of Cubism seems to be to identify components of the theory which are objective. So maybe I'm confused here, I don't know, but for me, when we are coming to Born rule and relation that should express something objective, then we are inside the theory, whereas the outcomes and reproducibility are elements which are somehow outside the theory.
I don't understand this point. I mean, repeatable measurements are quantum measurements, are examples of measurements in this theory.
But the objectivity of the existence of outcomes, for example, would be a clear case. The question of the objectivity of the existence of outcomes would be a case. And so I think that is a useful thing to distinguish. So that they're getting... So there are two questions, you're right. So what components of Cubist quantum theory are objective? And then there's a further question, what's the status of measurement outcomes? And there might be a worry that there isn't enough objectivity about those latter things for some people.
If I may just continue. Are we looking for a criterion for objectivity in the Cubism approach? And if we are looking for a criterion, isn't it that wouldn't be a candidate that Cubism tries to reconstruct quantum mechanics as a generalized theory of probability concerning beliefs? Wouldn't be a criterion the fact that you have a feature that was not expected a priori, and that in Born rule you have a specific formulation that would somehow not be derived a priori without the specific context of microphysics. And this is one question, and I had another question that was on my purple stick. I'm wondering if the maybe I put it a bit provocatively. The program is to look for all the subjective components of the theory, so at the end to be able to identify something that is objective. Is it possible to identify something that is objective, completely objective, given that you are embedded in a framework with subjective components? So isn't this alleged objective element you have identified in the Born rules somehow relative to those other subjective components? So it will be not purely objective, but maybe a kind of relative objectivity.
Okay, it's probably a question for me. So, well, I agree with the first point, and I think actually that's the objectivity we are looking for, the objectivity of, let's say, the Born rule, which you then question in your second part. I think the objectivity that most of the other contributors to this discussion we're looking for is not of that primary importance for us, and I think it's a secondary thing. You can, surely, starting from Cubism, you can ask about scientific community and how one comes to agreement and things like that, and then you could have something like an effective objectivity, if you like. But it would be a less fundamental notion. But for the second point, well, I think I just disagree. I think the important bit is that we regard the Born rule as a normative rule, and as a normative rule, I think it can have exactly that function, an objective normative rule that any agent should use. It's a normative requirement in order to organize his or her personal beliefs. I do not think there's a contradiction here. There would be a possible contradiction if it was a descriptive rule, or if it was sort of a rule that said how beliefs actually evolve or so. That I think wouldn't make any sense. But as a normative rule, I think it can have this function.
But there's a bit more, isn't there? Because not only is it a normative rule, namely telling you what you ought to do, but it's also the case that you think there are facts about the world that make it the case that one does better if one organises one's thoughts like this. So think about a completely objective Bayesianism, which would be a view which said that, fine, probabilities are degrees of belief, but there are facts about the world which completely constrain what those degrees of belief should be. And if you know those facts, then you definitely have to go for this degree of belief. Okay, the cubists say, no, there are no facts about the world which constrain your degrees of belief as tightly as that. However, they do constrain it to be some degree of belief within this set, this funny-shaped subset in the probability simplex. So there are facts about the world which make it the case that you ought to have one of these probabilities, but we're not going to tell you which one. So it's there's something objective there. It's objectively constraining the subjective degrees of belief.
But I'd like to hear Michael's thought on this, because what you asked is quite related to something that Michael had said in his preamble.
Yeah, I mean, what Chris says, I guess that sounds right to me. So, let me go back to the slide. So, that sounds right to me. So I don't have a long answer, but I don't have a lot that I want to add to that. But that sounds right to me, but I'm not sure if it's completely consistent with what you said, Chris, in this quote. Because
I thought it was further down a different quote.
no, what's this quote? Yeah, so what is too much? Do normative rules capture objective features of
or
the
our
world,
relation
or only of our relation to it?
Yeah, and that's
Right.
exactly what you're asking.
So if normative features capture some objective feature of our relation to the world, then surely that we're learning something about the world, and so doing that. But does that count as the wheat? Or does it count as?
Or are there some objective features about our relation to the world? Can't they be objective as well?
They can be objective. They can be objective. But so I guess so. My short addition to that question is that what you mean by the wheat? Is that all that you mean by the wheat, or did you want more when you wrote this?
Which
or
is
now?
more important, the wheat or the shaft?
I was wondering that. You
We
make
should
beer
give
from
others
wheat.
a chance to contribute. So Hans has waited for a long time.
I had a question to Chris when you started by giving several warning signs, which I found interesting. And one statement was that you don't see any success in philosophy to reconstruct the world from a first-person perspective. I think something like this you stated. Now, how is it, could you make a similar statement about attempts to construct the world from a multi-agent perspective, from a multi-agent scenario where each agent has a first-person perspective? Many first-person perspective plus agreement. You made some comments about Strawson and so on, and maybe you answered this already, but I just didn't.
So what I had in mind was first, from a perspective which assumes that, as it were, the contents of one's mind are actually logically personal to one. So it's quite a mouthful. So it's inevitably we learn about the world by knocking around in it, by interacting with other people and other things. But it doesn't follow from that the content of one's experience or what one learns, the first thing that one comes into contact with, is something that's restricted inside one's mind. That's all that I meant there. The comment with Strawson was that this was attempting to undermine this bewitching Cartesian picture of the lone ego, which is bravely making its way and trying to work out what it can know about the world. And his argument was that we can't the conception of ad ego is actually logically incoherent, and that we can only think of ourselves as the havers of experience and the enjoyers of consciousness, because we can also think of others in that way. So the concept of a mentality is an inherently plural one, not an inherently singular one. So that's very consistent with the multi-agent perspective.
But then, you know, if I think of a multi-agent perspective, I could not just reduce this to say this n minus one other agents are just part of the world. It must be something really different. And so you must, the agent must be able to perceive the other agent as agents. And this is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I had so I mean, since Rüdiger mentioned that, like when we were asking about the objectivity, you mentioned the objectivity of the Born rule. I mean, this gives us something concrete to talk about. So say, the point where we would see objectivity is in the fact that all the agents use the Born rule, if I understand correctly.
Should.
Yes,
Should.
you should use the Born rule. So isn't any axiomatization going to achieve this result? If you have a set of axioms, all the agents who buy those axioms would use the Born rule. Where do you draw the line then of like what you consider a successful, exciting type of result that explains? I mean, is it because it has to be done in a specific way, and which way are you?
Well, I mean, we're certainly not there, but what I would like is justification of the axioms in some independent way. So not just that they are simple and that they recover quantum mechanics, because that is sort of is almost self-serving, right? I mean, but you would like an axiom that you have some independent reason to believe, or that you can derive from some physical consideration. I mean, sort of an ideal which we are far from, but I would like to see as well. The participatory nature of the world implies this axiom, something like that.
Okay, yeah. So it's not just saying something about the world. Allegedly, every axiomatization has done that.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
they say in a world where such and such is true, you have quantum mechanics.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Should we go through some of these? Don't have that much time left.
We've
Don't
done
want to
that one.
overrun. So.
Shall I do the Everett one quickly?
Quickly.
Well, I think
How can one do the
answer
Everett
it.
one quickly?
It's easy. How would an Everettian even imagine reconstructing the formalism from a multiverse picture of reality?
Oh, that's just like me.
Who would ask such a question?
The writing looks like you as well. So the thought here is that what are, I think, the most successful and well worked out and philosophically satisfactory versions of Everettianism, the multiverse picture is very much non-fundamental. So the basic Everettian picture, and in fact this is in the 57 article too, the basic Everettian picture is it's just the universal wave function, the universal Hamiltonian, that's it. So it's a misplaced thing to say, look, here's the key idea of Everett, namely that there's a multiverse structure. The key idea, the key ontological conception is no, there's just wave function structure. And look, by the way, here's something interesting. It's still possible to recover an account of how people have determinate experiences within this structure. But multiversality, if you will, is not part of the fundamental ontological story. So it's a slightly misplaced challenge. And if it's, how would we get...
then may I place it better?
Sure.
Okay, so given what you just said, I would put it this way. So you said it's universal wave function structure. It's not multiverse structure. It's the imagery. Tell me how to pose universal wave function structure without already having the structure of quantum theory.
Well,
So that would be the challenge.
That's what I was going to go on to say.
Whatever the worldview is, and have wave functions pop out of the world.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say, that there looked like there'd be something absurd to say that, you know, this is the picture is of universal wave functions, and how do I get universal wave functions from them? Like, you've kind of got them. so, again, they'd say, look, we're not buying into this particular way of talking about things. Our view is that the job is as scientists to find out how the world is, and we make hypotheses, and we do further tests, and we come up with this looks like a satisfactory model which accounts for all the phenomena. Job done. And they said this is how we arrive at it. We arrive at it by the traditional means of scientific progress, not by pulling it out of a space of overall theories. So they're just going to reject the force of the question. There might be some perspectives from which there's a pressure to say, okay, look, how does this structure emerge, and which is valuable to say. How does the quantum theoretic structure emerge for some broader or more general class? And that might just be interesting per se, but it doesn't seem to me an objection to the Everettian that they start with the wave function, because that's just their starting point.
Is it more fair to say that Everettians are more concerned with how classical structure emerges?
Right. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah. Should we move on to the next one?
Yes.
There's a question. So.
Can I have a question about this universal wave function? So from the formalism point of view, it's very much kind of a Schrödinger picture of quantum mechanics. And you can always ask, okay, well, according to which equation actually this? And you can say, well, this is something which will evolve. Maybe we think about Schrödinger equation, but maybe some next theory and so on, and maybe this will be a relativistic one or whatever. But my question is that in quantum field theory, actually, it's very hard to come up with a Schrödinger picture that basically it's a Heisenberg picture, that you have these local algebras and so on. Is this something that is ever discussed
Yeah, to some extent it is. So you may know that David Deutsch likes his, what he calls the Heisenberg representation of quantum mechanics. It's not quite, it's more ontologically laden than ordinary quantum mechanics is. But you can do this kind of thing. I think it's actually relatively straightforward to move backwards and forwards between the Heisenberg and the Schrödinger pictures, even in the QFT case. So you can just talk about, if you want to. Fundamentally, it's always whatever one's calculating. It's a game that involves both states and operators. So you can certainly well conceive of having a density operator valued field in space-time, and your operators are your field operators. It's not really problematic, I don't think.
Do you know any in the literature, many worlds, do they ever discuss this moving?
There are some papers. I forget exactly who the chap's name is, but there has been some discussion of it using the Deutsch-Hayden representation in particular. And there's a paper that David Wallace and I have where we try and say, here's a way of thinking about things where you don't need to worry about it. So I'll send you that reference.
Didn't Matthias have a question also? Oh, sorry, I still need to usurp your chair.
No, that's fine. Give me a better view.
Question about the reconstruction. So, it sounded like that if you say that there is a method to reconstruct quantum theory that could be considered a weakness of the framework, or even an intrinsic redundancy of the framework, because it can do something. I mean, it could be either self-evident that you have it already there, like you have it in the interpretation, or you have somehow your whole framework admits a lot of things, and then you can derive something. So somehow deriving something shows that you have some kind of redundancy. So, is this a possible point of view, or?
Well, that one could have arrived at what one's got from some other route than one in fact did. That's the thought. So you're worrying that. So let's say that the Everettian says, look, we arrived at wave functions and all the rest of it just by the normal process of experiment, and then we come along and say, well, look, we could have got it another way, using these general constraints and then narrowing it down to here. So maybe that's so. And then your question was, would that be worrisome, for example, the Everettian, the fact that you could get to the same endpoint from two different routes?
For example, yes.
Yeah. So I don't see that it would. I mean, once you know what you're trying to get to, it's usually quite easy to find lots of different ways to get there.
Does Occam's razor go too far? I really want to comment on that.
I think this is a great question. I've no idea.
What does it mean?
Okay, I'd say yes, it does go too far. Let's say you have two theories, and one says that you are that agents matter in the world, they make a difference, and the other one says it's clockwork universe, just like I said before. And Occam's razor favors one or the other. Let's say Occam's razor favors the clockwork universe. I wouldn't take this as evidence that the clockwork universe is the right way of looking at the world.
Well, that's just an instance of the general proposition that you wouldn't take anything as evidence against participation. Because you know you're a free agent. So I guess there are different formulations of Occam's razor, aren't there? And it could make a difference which one has in mind. So roughly speaking, we often say, don't multiply entities beyond necessity, or don't import greater structure than the minimum amount that's needed to explain something. It's probably a rule of thumb rather than a strict methodological mustn't do otherwise.
Or most economic summary of a particular set of observations. Yeah, there are many ways, I guess.
I don't think it's the method of distinguishing between interpretations. It's the rules of thumb for theory building in the first place. Why make a theory more complicated than it needs to be? I don't think it's a criterion for deciding should I prefer this or that interpretation.
But there are cognitive versions of that, right, in statistics. So there's these two sides. There's the one thing like it's a rule of thumb, and they're really like particularly Bayesian inference, really quantitative methods that tell you throw away a model if you are about professional continuous method, and also in frequentist you have this kind of Willis theorem stuff where you have the same kind of statement, throw away the model which has too many key parameters because it's just not significant. So I think both, the question can relate to both problems. But I think it's invoked in particular in the foundations. It's often invoked, this kind of Occam razors in both versions, in the statistical version and in the rule of thumb version.
Yeah. So an objection that one sometimes hears to Everett is that it's ontologically extravagant, so you shouldn't believe it. So Occam's razor there, or perhaps Everettians might object to Bohmian, saying you're positing unnecessary ontology. These particle positions. You've got both the wave function and the particle position, so you shouldn't have both. So it is sometimes used there, but evidently undecisively.
What should we do next?
What is
We had this
We're only
already.
left with the tricky ones.
Yes.
Well, that one seems
This one we had answered
that
already.
one seems related to the other ones we
Which one?
answered. This one. What are participatory realists about?
I thought we had a long, specifically Cubists, we had a long discussion on this already, I think.
Yeah, I mean, but we answered another question, and then the process answered that, I think. Anyway.
Well, you want to?
Nope.
Great.
Sorry, do you have one there?
Yeah, comment on Richard Healy's statement about a short, steep, slippery, greasy slope.
It sounds like me again.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you comment then?
No.
I can't remember. I remember him.
But actually,
saying,
it fits this. How far goes too far?
Yeah.
He clearly has a sense that one can fall. So I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, that connects partly to some of my remarks, perhaps. So Richard is keen to say. So let's go back to Cubism tenet 3, which, as everybody will recall immediately, is that measurement outcomes just are personal experiences, and there are stronger and weaker ways that you might take that. So Richard wants the measurement outcomes. He wants that to be determinate. What's the phrase? Determinate physical magnitude values as a result of measurement outcomes. So it's just perfectly ordinary classical kind of fact that you've got whatever a certain amount of mass here, or a certain amount of your spin is here versus here. He wants those things to come out as perfectly determinate, and he thinks you're going to struggle to construct a plausible or construct a view of the world if you don't have, and you're not going to be able to do enough explaining, crucially, if you don't have enough of these things definitely out there. So he'd be worried that Cubism tenet 3 is taking too much of that kind of structure that you need to build a world away. And I guess he'd also say that we need more objectivity about probabilities than cubists want to allow. So he's more of an objective Bayesian, I think. He's happy with the idea that probabilities are expressions of degrees of belief. He thinks they're personal to the agents, in that they need to be responsive to things that agents could in principle know, so they're conditional on the past light cone of an agent. But they are, given what's in the agent's past light cone, it's fixed what your best probability is.
I was going to add something but maybe you should finish that, because what I was going to add is a separate thought.
Well, those are just a couple of. So Richard is, he thinks that if you don't have at least those two things, determinate, third-person, objective outcomes of measurement in the sense of not just detector clicks, but the having of definite values of certain physical magnitudes, and if you don't have more about what makes some degrees of belief better than others, then one's off on some kind of slippery slope to not having a world at all.
I was going to say, I don't know about horniness, but it seems to me there's a point beyond which you can't fall further. So
you can't fall further.
Yeah, out of any framework that you set up, so a qubits framework, you're gonna get to normative constraints, and the question is whether you physically motivated what you put into it. And as long as you physically motivated what you put into it, when you get to the normative constraint at the end of it, there's going to be a relation between you and the world. So you can't fall further than that. Like there has to be a stopping point.
So we're all at the bottom. You say you're at the bottom of.
Well, the point is you can't fall into complete solipsism if you consider these normative constraints as kind of like buffeting you from there.
Okay, then maybe he's. Oh, sorry.
I don't know whether this fits now. I would like to come back to the comment that you made, but maybe it doesn't fit now. You can choose when I ask my question.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I think I would like to pick up what you suggested and then Chris then answered in a certain way. And I would like to iterate on it. So you said, okay, suppose you have a theory that tells you that we really make a difference, agents matter on the world. And another theory that derives everything that happens, including what agent does in a mechanistic clock universe type of thing. So one theory that explains, first of all, agency. You can, using the theory, you can understand why other agents behave like they behave. But it's okay, you have this theory available, and then you have another theory that works on a certain algorithm you don't really understand, but it's a mechanistic process. You can feel like a supercomputer, and the supercomputer will tell you how the other agent will behave. On which theory would you rely, and what effect will it have on your agency towards others? I would support, really, and say I would also choose the other theory that tells me that agents make a difference, even though there is a mechanistic version of that, which I cannot understand. It's very complicated. Only a supercomputer can tell me the answer. And I'm wondering, why would I do that? I would do the same. And if we just apply Occam's razor, maybe this is a certain simple algorithm. It's easily specified. The algorithmic complexity is low, but the computational time, the logical depth is deep. We can never ourselves figure out. But what would it mean for our agency? And would we really?
I'd have a hard time getting out of bed.
Hard time getting out of bed?
Yes.
If
I thought the world was such.
Well, I'm not sure. My question.
Of course, I'd get out of bed because the world would make me do it.
Would you grumble at all, Chris?
No, but that's the easy answer. We are then just part of a big clockwork, so we stay in bed. But I do claim maybe it would even make sense. Maybe I'm talking of our compatibilist position, but I think it would even make sense to use our theory of agency just for says yes, I would prefer that you just use it. But I just want to throw it.
Well, not quite sure what to say.
Chris, what do you think?
I'm inclined to agree, and I think Peter Strawson would too. So, from a different paper of his, Freedom and Resentment.
And he would just, yes, I think you're right, but he would just ignore the fact that there is this damn supercomputer.
He would say we've got good reason for sticking with our normal ways of doing things because there's value in them.
I mean, the value is of course an important thing. The supercomputer theory is to be very ill-equipped to help us in designing new experiments and to navigate really. I mean,
And
just
to
by
understand others.
Sorry?
And to understand others. And understand them.
Yeah, well, in understanding others can always be put in the, I mean, basically dealing with them better, and I mean, it can always be put in that frame. Right? So I think that's a good place to stop. It is exactly 5:30.